This presentation is going to be a summary of attention disorders, which, as I mentioned in class, are not a separate category under disabilities that students can receive IEPs for, but it's included within a category that I'll discuss. Your textbook in Chapter 7 does a really great job of talking about attention disorders, as well as towards the end talking about some cognitive behavior and behavior management systems that help with students with attention disorders. I would encourage you to take a look at those as you're filling in your resource guide for different disabilities. So let's talk about attention disorders. And I have a picture of a fluorescent light on this slide simply because I kind of think of these as my fluorescent light students. This goes back to a very intelligent young man in high school that came to see me in my office, which at the time was in a fairly visible place. So he was very nervous about being seen talking to me because that would mean that there was something wrong. And he didn't want to give people the impression that anything was going wrong with him. But he really was struggling with bigger issues of school, such as forgetfulness, organization, deadlines on things, and he was getting really frustrated with himself that this was happening, and he was extremely bright and wanted to go into a profession that would require that he be organized and have these different things, and he was just thinking that it was going to be hopeless for him to ever be successful in that. And I remember as I was talking to him, his leg was moving up and down a mile a minute, and right in the middle of the conversation about a very serious element of the conversation, he just snaps his head and turns to me and says, "Do you hear that? Do you hear that?" And he said, that light is bothering me." And it was the fluorescent light in my office that was flickering ever so slightly. And that flicker was driving him kind of crazy during the whole discussion. Led me to believe, and accurately so, that this young man was dealing with attention disorders. And once he was able to get medical intervention for that, he became a much different student and actually very successful. So if you know people that are struggling with some of the things we're going to talk about in this section, if it truly is an attention disorder, if they get the appropriate treatment, it's almost like a day and night, light switch on, light switch off moment for these people when they're able to finally manage some of the distractions that seem to be flooding their mind. So let's talk a little bit about attention deficit disorders. There's a timeline that the textbook gives you, and I think it's kind of important to take a look at that because sometimes we think that, this attention deficit disorder and all we're hearing about it is a recent development and an explosion of overdiagnosis or invention of a diagnosis for a condition, when truthfully, attention deficit doctors were talking about this and seeing symptomology about this way back in the 1700s in Russia, when Melchior Adam first described, almost really described perfectly a person with an attention issue. One of his statements was that the person heard only half of everything that he said. And that seems to be the distractibility of people with attention deficit. And then Sir Alex Crichton was a Scottish doctor, and one of the things that he said about this group of people he was studying was that they seemed to only be able to attend with a tremendous amount of effort expended on their part to attend. And he described it as attention wasn't automatic, it required active effort. Dr. George Stills described a unique subgroup of people within this category, at least at the time, who were spiteful, cruel, disobedient, impulsive, and sometimes it seemed without remorse when they did things. And he described them as defective moral control, that they had defective moral control. As we see now, the population that Stills was working with and he was describing in his study were really more the students now that we call conduct disorder. But there was a commonality between the group of students that he was studying and students with, or children with actual attention issues, and that's that there was something going on, we knew, with the pathology of their brain, and we're going to talk about that in a bit. They were generally of normal or above average intelligence. Seemed to be more males that they were describing than females. It looked to have some hereditary genetic connections. And there were also other physical issues going on, or mental issues going on, such as depression or tics. Kurt Goldstein looked at, again, a different subgroup of people, and he looked at soldiers that had experienced brain injury in World War I. And the brain injury generally affected the middle brain areas. And what they were noticing, like the hippocampus area now that we are aware of, but what they were noticing is that people with these damaged hippocampus were disorganized, hyperactive, had what we call perseveration, meaning that they kind of repeated on a topic or an idea over and over again. And again, just like Crichton had talked about, this forced, they had to force themselves to respond appropriately to stimuli. They just had a difficult time attending. This little picture that you see at the bottom is kind of linked to the Heinz Werner and Alfred Strauss study. It's called the Strauss syndrome now, where they did studies on people with identified brain issues, definitely some of these soldiers that they were talking about, or people with mental retardation, and eventually even into students with cerebral palsy. And what they noticed is that when they gave them pictures of a foreground nature, these students could only see the background. They didn't notice the figures. So if you were talking about this particular picture that you see, they would just see the black and gray in the background, but they wouldn't see the geese or swans or whatever. I think those are actually swans flying through the background. In the forefront. They would not be able to see that. And so they felt that there definitely was indicating some pathology going on as well. And then William Cruikshank, the words that they were using, especially the terminology that was used by Stills with the defective moral control issue, kind of progressed into minimal brain injury, because we thought there was pathology going on with these children, and there is. And then eventually to the hyperactive child syndrome, because that just described the behavior, not necessarily implied any kind of brain deficit. So this is kind of a history starting in the 1700s now to present day about ADHD. So ADD, ADHD, it's been around for a long time, and we've just had a more difficulty focusing in on situations that are simply just ADHD going on and not maybe something caused by distraction because of a disability in a different category. So let's take a quick look at how the brain works, and now that we know that there is a pathology in the brain for people with ADD, I'm going to show you this short little video that kind of explains the different areas of the brain that are affected.
Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, or ADHD as it's commonly known, affects about 1 in 20 young people around the world. It can have a major impact on life at home, in school, and with friends. Symptoms of inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity can reduce a person's ability to control their actions and concentrate without getting distracted. Some people have expressed skepticism about the disorder, but brain imaging has shown that symptoms of ADHD are associated with a series of abnormalities in the development and function of parts of the brain. Let's look first at the cortex, the brain's surface layer. In normal development, the cortex, which plays key roles in memory, attention, thought, and language, gradually increases in thickness before reaching a peak during teenage years. Scans have shown that in children with ADHD, the cortex generally develops more slowly, particularly in frontal and temporal lobe regions, which are important for memory and controlling behaviour. Typically, the frontal cortex, along with other major parts of the brain, are smaller in children with ADHD than in those without. These different parts of the brain do not operate in isolation, but interact extensively to form networks controlling functions such as language, attention, and movement. The activity of different networks increases and decreases to allow different functions to take place. For example, while you are watching this video, activity in networks involved in processing information will have typically increased, while activity in networks involved in mind wandering will have typically decreased. In a person with ADHD, the activity of these networks is impaired, and connections within the networks are disrupted. And when we look more closely at the communication between these networks, there is also disruption in the release of the chemicals, dopamine and noradrenaline, which are responsible for relaying messages between brain cells. Overall, when children with ADHD carry out particular tasks, some networks are not switched on enough, while others remain switched on too much. Research from around the world has shown widespread differences in the development and function of the brain in children with ADHD. While we can't yet use brain imaging to diagnose the disorder, the more we can learn about ADHD in the brain, the better we can understand the symptoms that children with ADHD experience in everyday life.
So as you can see from that previous video, that we're talking about some differences in brain structure and brain wiring, and especially in the neurotransmitters in the brain. And this has been sort of a recent understanding of what's going on in the ADHD brain. Some myths that probably developed about ADHD, especially the causes of ADHD, came because we didn't have access to the fMRIs and different chemical sensing technology that we have now. But some original things that you might have heard, these were things such as ADHD is caused by video games. Now, it isn't caused by video games, but I do think that it could be irritated by overuse of video games. It's not caused by diet, and then I've got some other things in your diet such as sugar, or special allergies to certain foods like gluten or casein, which is a milk allergy. Those things haven't directly been linked to causing ADHD. In fact, there was at one point a diet developed by Dr. Feingold that was kids who had ADHD were submitted to following this diet, elimination of certain dyes and things and additives in their food. It was a pretty restrictive diet. It was a huge commitment on the part of the families to go with the Feingold diet, and it was kind of mixed reviews whether or not the students were seeing any improvement in their symptoms going on this diet. So these were all things that people were trying to control when they thought that perhaps ADHD was caused from an external factor. We know now that it's caused by an imbalance of the neurotransmitters and some differences in the brain structures. But something to be understood is that teratogens, those things from the outside like chemicals, additives that come into the body during pregnancy, certainly can create issues for ADHD in the child. We're looking obviously at lead. That's a teratogen that we've been concerned about. Mercury, tobacco, those things that we've talked about as causing genetic issues for all sorts of disabilities can also create issues of attention in children as well. So we've kind of boiled down now attention deficit into some different subcategories. Before, when we were just starting to get good at understanding attention deficit disorders, we were just really talking about ADHD, hyper, and ADD, not hyper, and we didn't have really anything in between, but now we have some different categories. So let's kind of take a look at just the general disorder. And as I said before, there is no category for special education called simply attention deficit disorder. It would fall under the category of other medical health impaired. So conditions like diabetes, epilepsy, those things are also considered under other medical health impaired, and ADHD or ADD is also in that category. And so this is something that I really want to stress, is that you understand that in order to determine if a child has an attention disorder, it is a medical diagnosis. It is not made by teachers or any type of special education educators. It must be made by a doctor. So we still have about 7 to 9% of our students that are being diagnosed with this. Actually, that's a bit of a drop. And we found that earlier we were diagnosing kids with attention deficit disorders that maybe had dyslexia or even autism, because we didn't have a handle on what those conditions were. And so once we were able to sort out how those things were different from attention deficit issues, that number has dropped a bit. So 7 to 9%, but definitely more males are diagnosed than females. This seems to be definitely gender linked. However, I will say that most often I think that you will see the H aspect in males, and I think that's perhaps why they're diagnosed just a bit more with it, because oftentimes in females you'll see more of the just ADD, which is less of a hyperactive movement connection, is more of a zony kind of thing. And so because those students don't tend to create behavior issues in the classroom, they don't get the attention of the teacher maybe as often either. And how do you diagnose a student, or how does a doctor diagnose a student with attention issues? It's definitely done through it's done by medical professionals, but it is done just like our autism. It's done through observation scales, and I'm going to show you some of those in a bit. So under the DSM-5, which you now know is the medical criteria manual that we use, I'll show you what the different criteria look like. We must, in order to say that it's attention deficit disorder, it must interfere with performance in 2 or more settings, not just school, but maybe at home, school and home, or school in some other setting. It must demonstrate itself before the age of 12, and we also have to rule out that there's anxiety or mood disorders coming in. So I'll pull up the diagnostic criteria right now, and you can find the diagnostic criteria simply by looking for the DSM-5. And under the DSM-5, you will see these criteria. Whenever you have the DSM-5, you're going to see these numbers that you see to the far right. That is the coding that's used, especially in insurance, to show what the issue is. So in attention deficit hyperactive, you'll see that there are 6 or more of the symptoms have persisted for 6 or more months to the degree that it's consistent and developmentally negatively impacts social and academic. And then we go through all of these different symptoms that you see. Hyperactive and impulsivity. So here was inattention. Here's the hyperactive and impulsivity part of it. And again, they talk about 5 of the symptoms are required if you're an older student, and the criteria that I mentioned. So this is in the DSM-5. And if you're combined, it's this code. If you're predominantly inattentive, it's this code. And if you're predominantly hyperactive, impulsive, it's this code. So that's how the DSM-5 records those things. Okay. Let me get back on track here. All right. So next, let's talk about these different subcategories. And the assignment that you have for this presentation is to go in and to not only talk about the different subcategories, and your textbook does a pretty good job of listing these as well, but how do you help a student in that particular area? Because it's one thing to know it exists, and believe me, mostly with your students with attention deficit, you're going to know that there's some sort of attention issue going on, especially if they're the H hyperactive or impulsive type. When we talk about hyperactivity, we're talking about fidgeting, leaving their seat when it's not time to leave their seat, that excessive talking. I remember having a female student once that had the H aspect, and her parents told me they thought that if I put her in the far right corner of the classroom where there was the block wall and pretty much that was all to talk to, they figured she could find a way to have a conversation with the block wall. And that's kind of the frustration, is that they just are constantly talking at inappropriate times and with an endless stream of talking. With impulsivity, they will blurt out answers. They don't wait their turn. They interrupt conversations of others. And yes, you can have both H and the hyperactive and the impulsive together in a student and not just separate as well. And so you can see where this type of attention issue, it's going to create school issues, but it's going to also create social issues for these students too. And then we have the students that are in the different other categories, the inattentive or without hyperactivity. And we usually say that these students, they tend to be the ones staring out the window, watching the squirrel instead of the squirrel in the grass instead of watching the teacher teaching in front. So they don't, and they also don't see trees in the forest. They just see the forest. They just have a difficulty focusing on details. And then they're very, and I would say this is also true though for the students that are the H and the impulsive. Across the board, you're going to see issues with organization in all of the categories. And so therefore, when you support a child with ADHD, you are going to definitely be addressing organization issues with them. Sometimes we think that these students seem really sluggish. They don't always, they have difficulty following multiple step directions. Conversation can be difficult for them, often even appearing somewhat shy. And so these are inattentive, without hyperactivity. If they have attention deficit, and we're not going to differentiate, there's a code for that. And then there could be a combination of things. So we've gotten better at kind of teasing out these subcategories. So, okay, I told you that you as a teacher cannot say your child has attention deficit disorder or anything like that. You can recommend to parents that they have their child assessed for focus issues or attention issues, but using the words ADHD isn't something that you can do because you are not a medical doctor. However, you are probably going to be a part of the diagnosis issues when a parent does take a child in to be diagnosed to see if they actually have an attention issue. I'm going to show you first the Conners rating scale, because a Conners rating scale will be something you will see frequently at several times for a student. First of all, you're going to see the Conners rating scale at the beginning. More than likely, you will be asked to fill out one. It was developed by Dr. Conners. And what you're asked to do is, are they angry or resentful? And then you have this categorization of not at all, just a little, pretty much, very much. And you circle these answers, and then you return this form to the doctor or to the parents who return it to the doctor. And based on the information that the doctor gets from all of these different Conners ratings, parents as well as teachers, they may make a determination also then based on maybe their observation or conversations or interviews with the child that yes, this child indeed seems to have an attention disorder, and then they might proceed with some sort of treatment plan. There is no blood test for ADD or ADHD. The only other somewhat data-driven test that they might give, and it's not as popular as it was in the beginning of exploration of ADHD. I don't hear doctors using this nearly as much. Is something they'll call the TOVA test, TOVA, TOVA test, and you can see a picture of a little boy here actually completing a TOVA test. And what happens on the screen is that whenever a certain dot shows up, he's supposed to, in his hand, he's got the clicker, and he's supposed to click that button to record when he's seen it. And then what they do look at is, okay, how often did he miss it, or become distracted and pay attention to other stimuli. So you can see here on the left side where there's pre-treatment for the disorder, that the child, this child is not very attentive. He's missing things. There's impulsive things where we judge it by pushing the button when there's nothing there, or distracted by pushing a button when there's a green box on the screen instead of the red box, or whatever it might be. And then they record this. They record the findings and find out that based on this data, this child would be seen to be as having an attention issue. Then they go through a treatment plan with the child, and in order to see if the treatment is helping, they give a post-treatment test as well. So the TOVA test is more more data-driven, but isn't necessarily considered at all even close to 50% accurate. Some doctors believe it doesn't show at all. Others, would use maybe the TOVA in conjunction with interviews and parent reports to kind of put it all together. So, but there are these different tests, different scales to look at. Okay, so we know that diet doesn't cause attention deficit, and we also know that there's a pathology, a chemical that's going on in the brain. But I do want you to understand that you as a teacher or as a parent can make attention disorders worse than they really are. So the child might have a predisposition to not focusing or having impulsivity, but practices at home or in school can certainly make things much, much worse for these kids. And these are some of the things that can make attention deficit worse in children. Moving too quickly through material or directions so they don't have a chance to focus and process. Using just auditory-based instruction and not other types of modes of learning. Arranging the classroom so a student might be out of your sight lines, and when you arrange your classrooms, you want to make sure that all your students can see you. Keeping students in their seats for all of their learning instead of allowing them to get up, engage, and move. Maybe turning down the lights in a classroom when you're trying to see something can actually make things worse for them. When you're just using a textbook as the focus of your lessons, asking the kids to copy from the board or from the screen, and then just sort of overlooking about the emotional needs of students. Now, if you look through this list, I know that I, as a teacher, have been guilty of doing these things, and then I wonder why I might have a child that's having trouble paying attention. Well, I'm irritating attention ability in any student when I do these things, but imagine how much worse it makes it for students with attention deficit. Something that I know that I talked about in Ed Psych is called the SOAR binder system, and I'm going to kind of make a little bit more of a commercial for that system. Okay, so the SOAR binder system was developed by, and I'm taking you to the website where you can go, and I'm going to kind of shoot this around so you can see it. Well, it's not helping very much here, but the system was developed by Susan Kruger, and if you type in studyskills.com or just even type in the SOAR binder system, you're going to find that you can get the SOAR binder, and I'm going to roll down to a video of her talking about her system, and I'm going to review for you what the SOAR binder system really is.
Hi there, I'm Susan from SOAR Learning and studyskills.com. And today I want to address an email that came in from Beth R. She's a middle school mom who's concerned about her son's organization. She saw some information on our binder system, and she brought a question to our attention about her child who might not want to stand out amongst all of his peers. So I'm preparing this video to actually answer Beth's question, and also this is something that you can share with your children, with your students, with teachers or administrators, anyone who is impacted by the process of keeping students organized. Now, if you're not familiar with our binder system, what we do is we take this traditional method of having a separate folder and notebook for each class, which often means that students have to carry 12 to 16 different folders and notebooks around. We take this and we condense it down to one binder. Now, obviously, this is just more streamlined to begin with, but there's actually a very brain-friendly reason why this works better. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you why the binder is better according to your brain, and then the second thing we'll do is we'll talk about some alternatives. If you are having trouble making this work within your school, or maybe there's a teacher who's got a system and is not really sure that she wants to adjust it, we'll address some alternatives for that. The brain is a collection of neuron wires, billions of them. These neuron wires literally create pathways in our brain for every thought and movement we make. And although we have billions of them in our head, any one of these neuron connections is really just like this circuit here. This string of lights represents the circuits in our brain. The first bulb is our frontal cortex. It receives information.
Okay, so I'm going to skip to the next part where Beth talks about how to make the binder system work and the difference between the SOAR binder system and the system that most
An example.
people
I will
use.
outline every single command on the brain circuit. If we are in class and our teacher passes out homework, we will have to grab the paper, set the paper down, reach down, open the book bag, move books out of the way, flip through the folders, find the right folder, grab the folder, pull it out, set it on the desk, open the folder, slide the paper in, close the folder, pick the folder up, reach down, grab the book bag, open the bag, move books, hold the other folders back, slide the folder in, set the bag down, and return to an upright position for a total of 22 connections on the brain circuit. The SOAR system for organizing papers, however, was developed to promote simplicity. When the teacher hands us a paper in this situation, we grab it, open the binder, flip to the subject folder, slide the paper in the folder, and close the binder for a grand total of only 5 connections on the brain circuit. Look at this difference. The SOAR system has 77% fewer steps, making it 440% more efficient on our brain energy. So now you've seen some reasons why the binder is so brain friendly. The final thing I'd like to do is just share some alternative points. First, I'd like to talk to students. If you are a student, whether you're in middle school or high school, I encourage you to be a leader within your class because most of your classmates are struggling with the same things, the same challenges of keeping track of assignments, all these different folders and notebooks. It's a big strain, not only because it's a lot to carry, but it is a tremendous amount to keep track of. So be a leader within your class and take control of your own organizational process by simplifying everything for yourself. Now, the other thing is you can keep it subtle. You don't have to keep our cover sheet in your binder. You can even purchase a smaller binder. I've got a 1-inch binder here. And if you follow our tips in our system, you actually can make it all work with a 1-inch binder. So this, again, will just keep everything very subtle. You don't have to stand out or make a big statement with this. And finally, if you have a reluctant teacher that maybe has their own system and isn't really willing or interested in compromising with the SOAR binder, then go ahead and follow whatever it is that teacher's asking you to do. You can still get all the rest of your folders and notebooks condensed down, and you still are going to be making a significant improvement by getting 80% of your materials reduced down to this one binder. Now, for teachers who have their own system for organizing things, this is something I run into a lot. I've done in-services across the country, and often I'll run into, particularly science teachers seem to be the most common, where they like to have one separate binder for their class. Usually they'll have some different tabs inside, organizing labs, vocabulary terms, different assignments. If that's something that you can relate to in some form, the idea here is to minimize the transitions for students as they're going back and forth between classes and home from school. So in that situation, what you can do is keep your binder within the classroom and allow students to keep all of their materials organized there. And anything that needs to go home, that needs their attention at home, they can take out of their binder in class and put it in their SOAR binder. When you have everything condensed down to one binder, you'll actually be surprised at how much more easy it will be for the students to get all that information back to you into class and keep it all together. All right, if you have any further questions or interest to adjust it, we'll...
Okay, so that SOAR binder handout is on Moodle, and you can take a look at that. Again, it's basically the steps for creating the SOAR binder, but it's everything that the kids need. This was a tremendous aid for my students that were on the spectrum, were with had attention issues, and quite honestly, I had kids who had really no identified disability at all coming and saying to me, I really want to learn about this binder system. It just makes more sense to me. And you can see by when you look at the comparative pile of notebooks and then the one binder, system, that it is much easier for students to travel between classroom and home and school with these different things. So I found it to be one of the number one tools that I use to help my students become better organized. I still today, when I teach classes, I organize my lectures and things in a SOAR binder and bring it back and forth so that I have everything I need when I need to bring it home. So I still practice what I preach today when it comes to SOAR binders. So the website that I tried to show you in the beginning here, she has other study tools that she manages on her website, but I would say that the SOAR binder is probably my favorite of the ones that you think that you might want to use. So if you have any more questions about that, certainly ask. Okay, so this is going to be the end of what I'm talking about with ADHD. Your task is to complete that chart, and there will be questions about ADHD on the test. So make sure that you have reviewed Chapter 7 on attention deficit disorder, because there's a lot of issues there that are covered, as well as the fact that you are going to encounter several students every year that are going to that will benefit from you understanding it more. All right, thank you very much and have a great week.